The metallic tang of iron, the damp earth, a scream that rips through stone but finds no exit. We speak of gladiators as tragic heroes, enslaved warriors battling for the masses' entertainment. But beneath the sun-drenched sand of the Colosseum, in the perpetually dark tunnels where light never touched, an untold horror unfolded. Rome preferred not to name it, yet it lingered, a festering wound in the empire's grand narrative. This is not a tale of valiant combatants. This is the story of the women captured during Rome's relentless expansion. Women who met gladiators not in the roaring arena, but in the desolate cells beneath it. What did Rome do with its female prisoners, and what did these men, these human beasts forged by the empire, do to them?
The official version of history is comfortable, serene. It paints a picture of Roman law protecting its women, of gladiators held under strict command, of an empire upholding moral codes. Yet fragmented documents whisper a different truth, a truth scrawled in accidental testimonies, preserved in private letters never meant to survive, and revealed in the chilling bureaucracy of administrative records. Imagine, if you will, a ledger from Pompeii, unearthed from the ashes, dated around the year 62 after the birth of Christ. It belongs to a lanista, a proprietor of a gladiator school. With the dispassionate tone of one inventorying livestock, he recorded the purchase of 12 barbarian females, noting a reduced price for recreational use of the fighters. The entry continues, utterly devoid of emotion, stating, "The investment recouped in 6 months through private rentals." Private rentals, 2 words that open an abyss into human depravity. Rome did not perceive these captured women as people. They were spoils of war, mere merchandise, flesh to be exploited. When Roman legions swept across Gaul, Germania, Britannia, or North Africa, the men faced death or harsh enslavement. The women, however, were destined for different, often more harrowing fates. Some were absorbed into wealthy Roman households as domestic servants. Others were funneled into public brothels. But there existed a third, far less documented, and infinitely darker path, the gladiator schools, known as ludi. These institutions, massive investments for the lanistas, required their fighters to be motivated, controlled, and rewarded. Gladiators were expensive assets. Their training, sustenance, and medical care cost fortunes. These were men bred to kill, held captive, men who understood that death likely awaited them in their next bout. Such men were inherently dangerous. Rebellions were not uncommon. Spartacus's revolt, the most infamous, nearly brought Rome to its knees. The proprietors learned their lesson: keep the gladiators content, well-fed, and satiated. The female prisoners became an integral, horrifying part of this system of control. Deep beneath the Ludus Magnus, Rome's largest gladiator school, directly connected to the Colosseum by a maze of subterranean tunnels, archaeologists made a chilling discovery. Separate cells, tiny and narrow, with chains bolted to the rough-hewn stone walls. For decades, historians assumed these were simple punishment cells for disobedient gladiators. However, forensic analysis in 2018, conducted on bones found within these very cells, revealed a different, sickening reality. The skeletons were female, predominantly young, bearing marks of repeated trauma. This was no ordinary dungeon. A wax tablet, preserved by Vesuvius's fiery embrace in Herculaneum, contains a letter from a Thracian gladiator named Marcus to his mother. He meticulously describes his training, the brutal combats, and then, almost as an afterthought, he casually mentions, "After our victories, they give us the barbarians. They say it is our right, our prize.
but their eyes haunt me, even in my sleep. Their eyes haunt me. Even within this crucible of horror, a twisted hierarchy emerged. Veteran gladiators, those who defied death through many battles, earned privileges, superior accommodations, better food, and preferential access to the prisoners. Novices were left with the remnants. Yet all were expected to participate. To refuse was seen as weakness, and weakness in the gladiators' world spelled certain death.
These women had no names in the registers. They were reduced to descriptors: the Gaulish woman, the German, the Briton. Sometimes physical traits sufficed: the blonde, the tall one, the one with the scar. Their humanity had been stripped away long before they ever reached the ludi. It began when Roman soldiers first captured them, when chains bit into their wrists, when they were branded with hot iron to signify ownership. At that moment, Rome had already rendered them inconsequential. Galen, a Roman physician who served as a surgeon in gladiator schools around the year 105 after the birth of Christ, left behind exhaustive medical notes. He documented treatments for combat wounds, specialized diets, and recovery exercises. Tucked amidst these clinical observations is a short, deeply disturbing passage. The females kept on the second lower level, Galen writes with chilling detachment, frequently develop fevers that resist treatment. I recommended isolation, but the proprietors insist that the cost of replacement is less than the cost of prolonged care. The cost of replacement is less. Galen, a man of science, spoke of human lives with the same cold economic logic a farmer might apply to ailing chickens. Yet there was something even more monstrous, something Rome audaciously transformed into public spectacle. It wasn't only the gladiators who exploited these prisoners. The Roman public itself, filling the amphitheaters of the Colosseum, cheering at the chariot races in the Circus Maximus, during public celebrations, they too craved a share in this degradation. Rome practiced a form of public execution, damnatio ad bestias, rarely mentioned in polite histories. Criminals, Christians, prisoners of war, all flung into the arena with lions, tigers, and bears. The crowds roared their approval. But a variation existed, far more depraved. Female prisoners, particularly those of high social standing in their homelands, daughters of tribal chiefs, priestesses, even captured queens, were subjected to theatrical executions. These were public reenactments of Roman myths where they were forced to play female characters in scenes of mythological violation. Pasiphae and the bull, Leda and the swan, Europa abducted. This was not mere execution. It was orchestrated, fetishized trauma for mass entertainment, a depraved spectacle that stripped humanity bare. A Roman historian named Suetonius, chronicling the reign of Emperor Nero, provides a horrifying glimpse. He writes that Nero commanded a Briton prisoner of noble birth to be dressed as the Princess Andromeda and then chained to a post in the arena. A gladiator, costumed as Perseus, was then released, but instead of saving her, the gladiator was ordered to violate her before an audience of 50,000 spectators. 50,000 human beings, watching, applauding. Rome didn't merely tolerate this violence. Rome sanctified it, transforming raw brutality into art, into myths, into divine entertainment. And the gladiators themselves, were they victims or were they perpetrators? The harrowing answer is both. This disturbing duality is precisely what makes their story so difficult to confront. They were slaves, these men, captured, bought, forced to kill or be killed. Freedom was a word they only whispered in nightmares. their future stretching no further than the next gruesome fight. Many had been brutalized from childhood, trained meticulously to extinguish life, systematically desensitized to suffering. They were, in essence, human weapons, honed and wielded by an empire that recognized no limits. Yet they were still men who, when granted even a flicker of power, temporary, conditional power bestowed by their owners, often wielded it against those even more vulnerable than themselves. The female prisoners were not their enemies. They were not combatants. They were simply women, captured, terrified, trapped. And still many gladiators accepted the horrifying prize offered to them. A piece of crude graffiti scratched into the wall of a cell in the Ludus of Capua speaks volumes. It reads, "Victory over 10 men in the arena. Defeat every night when I close my eyes." Below it, in a different hand, someone added, "The gods judge us not by what we are forced to do, but by what we do when no one forces us." When no one forces us, this simple phrase pierces the darkness. Yes, the Lanistas offered the women as rewards, but did the gladiators have to accept? Some, remarkably, refused, and this act of defiant compassion is, against all odds, documented. A Greek gladiator named Nicomedes famously requested to be flogged instead of accepting a Gaulish prisoner. He was mocked, ridiculed by his fellow fighters, branded a weakling, called a woman. But he chose humiliation over an act of violation. His choice, a singular flicker of light in a vast, dark expanse, stands as a testament to the possibility of humanity, even in the most inhumane conditions. Most, however, did not make that choice. The system was perfectly engineered in its cruelty. Rome took victims and meticulously transformed them into perpetrators. It took brutalized men and handed them other human beings to brutalize. Thus, the cycle of violence was not merely perpetuated, it was justified, normalized, ingrained into the very fabric of their society. The few women who survived this ordeal, and precious few did, were eventually discarded. They were sold to low-tier brothels, condemned to the crushing darkness of mines, or banished to remote farms. Some simply vanished from all records, erased as if they had never existed. There are no tombs for them, no grand memorials, no names etched in stone. Rome built triumphal arches to trumpet its military conquests, erected majestic statues of its generals, and immortalized emperors on coins and towering monuments. But the prisoners who endured the tunnels beneath the Colosseum, the women offered as prizes to victorious gladiators, those violated before roaring multitudes, these Rome chose to forget. And for centuries, we too acquiesced to that deliberate amnesia. As the acclaimed historian of ancient Rome, Mary Beard, eloquently observed, the greatness of Rome was built upon a sea of suffering that we prefer not to examine too closely, because if we dare to look, truly look, we realize that the mechanisms of dehumanization Rome employed have not vanished, they have merely mutated, adopted new disguises. It is a chilling truth. These insidious mechanisms persist. When we abstract people into nameless enemies, barbarians, terrorists, illegals, we echo the very language Rome used to justify its atrocities. When we silently accept that certain groups of humans deserve less dignity, fewer rights, or shallower compassion, we perpetuate that ancient, dangerous logic.
Rome created that its prisoners were less than human because they were barbarians,
because they were enemies, because Rome claimed a divine right to conquer and subjugate. Under this chilling rationale, any violence became justifiable, any horror merely a natural part of the established order. The gladiators, in their own twisted justification, told themselves they deserved those women, that it was their right, their reward for risking their lives in the arena. And under that logic, they could ignore the haunting eyes, the muffled screams echoing in the tunnels, the fundamental humanity they were choosing to violate. The most terrifying truth about Rome is not simply that it was cruel. Countless civilizations have been cruel. The most terrifying truth is that Rome was cruel in a systematic, organized, and utterly normalized fashion. Rome institutionalized violence, transformed it into spectacle, wove it into the very fabric of its culture, and it flourished for centuries.
The throngs in the Colosseum stands were not some special breed of monster. They were ordinary people, fathers, mothers, merchants, artisans, children. They brought their food, chatted amongst themselves, and laughed, all while witnessing people being killed, tortured, and violated. Why? Because this was normal. Their society had decreed it legitimate entertainment. How many atrocities do we, today, consider normal simply because our society has legitimized them? How much suffering do we ignore because the victims have been categorized as less important, less human, less deserving of our compassion? These are not questions to be lightly dismissed. In the vast archives of the Vatican, preserved among thousands of ancient documents, lies a curious letter. It dates from the 5th century, a time when Christianity had become Rome's official religion, and the brutal gladiator games were gradually being abolished. A priest writes to another, expressing relief at the cessation of deadly combats in the arena. Yet his relief is tinged with a profound concern. "I fear," he pens, "that in abolishing the games, we are merely hiding our violence, not eliminating it. The men who watched deaths with pleasure, they have not vanished. They will merely seek other places, other forms, to satisfy the same obscure impulses." The priest, in his wisdom, was disturbingly prescient. Violence did not disappear. It merely shape-shifted, finding new disguises, new justifications, new names.
So today, 2 millennia later, as we gaze upon the weathered ruins of the Colosseum, as tourists snap smiling photos on the very ground where 50,000 Romans once watched lives extinguished, we are compelled to ask a profound question. Have we truly evolved, or have we merely become more sophisticated in concealing our cruelty? Rome declared that the prisoners did not matter. They were mere barbarians, mere property, mere flesh. And under that chilling logic, everything was permissible. What similar logics do we accept today? Which groups of humans do we silently, collectively, decide matter less? And what violences do we justify with these insidious categorizations?
The tunnels beneath the Colosseum are silent now. The chains on the walls have long since rusted away. The bones, catalogued and preserved, lie in museum collections. But the mental mechanisms that allowed those horrors, the dehumanization, the categorization, the normalization of violence against the vulnerable, these mechanisms endure. For power, in any era, always finds a way to sanctify its own sins. It always concocts a logic to justify the horror. It always convinces ordinary people that certain cruelties are necessary, natural, even noble.
And you, as you reflect on this dark chapter of Rome's history, as you contemplate the nameless prisoners who endured those dark tunnels, As you imagine the haunting eyes that troubled even their perpetrators, can you see the parallels with our own time? Can you identify where our society still employs the same logic, merely cloaked in different words? Or do we, like Rome, prefer not to look too closely? Do we prefer the comfortable versions of history, where we are always the civilized, always the evolved, always the ones who instinctively know right from wrong?
The eyes of those prisoners still watch us across the centuries, waiting for us to finally see them, waiting for us to finally learn. They whisper of a truth we ignore at our peril. The past is never truly past if its lessons remain unheeded. Understanding these ancient cruelties is not about condemnation. It is about recognizing the timeless fragility of human dignity and the constant vigilance required to protect it. For in the dark mirrors of history, we might just find reflections of ourselves.